There are so many strikes against a person who's coming out of the justice system and trying to integrate back into society. A lot of different places you could even start with that question, but let's tackle the obvious. Let's talk about the felony background. So as soon as you've got to check that box on a job application or a housing application, most of the time that spells game over, on to the next applicant. Now, of course, there are employers out there who are more second chance oriented, and we try really hard as an organization to find those employers and make sure they're reputable companies and connect our clients to them. But it can be difficult, and oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, those employers, they can be known for shady and dishonest practices. Those situations can turn exploitative. I'm talking about things like doing odd jobs for somebody in exchange for rent or lodging, or just working an insane amount of hours and being underpaid or sometimes not paid at all. I can recall helping one gentleman apply for a job, and we looked into a food distribution warehouse. It's not there anymore, but and they were pretty well known to take people with felonies. And I was talking to the hiring manager and just asking questions about the job, and it was packing produce in a cooler all night on graveyard shifts. And when she told me the schedule, the hours were, the first night was 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., the second night was 9 p.m. to 4 a.m., and the third night was 12 a.m. to 7 a.m. Just this schedule that was all over the place, all over the clock. And I remember thinking, man, I'm a fairly stable guy by most people's standards, and I couldn't work a schedule like that, let alone if you're homeless and depleted. And so oftentimes, those are the types of jobs that are readily available to people with felonies. The other aspect that makes reintegration back into society difficult is just the psychological effects of institutionalization. So you take somebody who's been incarcerated for years and years, and they're coming out of a highly structured environment where they're essentially told when you can eat, when you can sleep, when you can do your laundry, when you can take a shower. And then all of a sudden you throw that person back into society and expect them to be independent and self-sufficient and productive. And of course we measure that by whether they are employed and have stable housing. And oftentimes those things are just so out of reach for somebody who's just coming out of prison. And if you don't have somebody in your corner who's really walking alongside of you and helping you relearn some of those skills that you've missed out on when you've been locked away, it can be near impossible to get any kind of forward motion back in society. So a nonviolent offender is somebody who's been tried and convicted of a crime that is nonviolent according to state statutes. So usually these are things like DUI, drug possession, drug trafficking, theft, things like that. And it gets tricky because what's considered a violent crime differs from state to state. So for example, burglary is considered a violent crime in some states. And the idea is that the psychological violence done to somebody upon the realization that their personal space has been violated, you could certainly make a case for that, but in reality, less than 3% of burglaries that take place in the US every year end in an act of physical violence and bodily harm towards someone. Another example of this is in North Carolina. It is considered a violent crime to sell drugs within 1,000 feet of a school or playground. So there's a lot of nuance when you think about what is a violent crime. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of nuance with that label, violent offender. As soon as you hear that means one thing in people's mind. I'm not an expert on any of this stuff, but I think the point that I'm making, along with many criminal justice reform advocates, is that there are far too many people who are behind bars, who have been charged with violent crimes that really, at the end of the day, do not pose an imminent danger or threat to society and others. And I think that's the bottom line issue that we really need to take a sobering look at. People can't post bail because they can't afford to. And so what will happen from there is they will sit in the county jail until they can plead to their charges. And this process can take weeks up to months. And when they finally plead to their charges and get a court date, the court system will grant them a public defender if they can't afford to hire an attorney. Now, what happens if somebody bails themselves out of jail is that the court system will see that, and they really make an arbitrary broad brush decision that if that person can bail themselves out of jail, then they can obviously afford an attorney. And so they typically will not grant that person a public defender. And so then, when in reality, that person has scraped up every single financial resource they have to bail themselves out of jail. And when they get out of jail, they have no financial support to find any kind of path to success. And so they're also forced to hire an attorney that they really can't afford, which then plunges them further into debt cycles that ultimately land them back into the same cycles that they were in before they went to the jail in the first place. And so it's really a lose-lose situation. So the short answer is no. If they are lucky, they may have had a case manager working with them while they're incarcerated, helping them get the ball rolling on job searches or applying for SSI benefits if they're medically disabled. But this is a rarity. It's usually not the case. More often than seldom, we've seen the opposite, where somebody discharges from prison, they are extremely medically vulnerable and incapacitated and need nursing level care, and there's no paper trail on any state benefits or assistance. And they also, after they come out of prison, they are immediately put on a financial obligation to pay back DOC for their incarceration. So this sets them back. And then I have heard of federal prison releases where they are granted $50 upon their release, which it certainly helps, but really it's just a drop in the bucket when you think about the grand scheme of what's stacked against them coming out of prison. So in short, discharge planning is really just at this point, I regret to say, it's just something that's not real robust and strategic.